Hey guys, Phil Cook here. Just wanted to give my thoughts on the concept of the Air Canada strike. So if you don't know about the Air Canada strike, if you've been living under a rock, basically the flight attendants at Air Canada went on strike because they were getting really low wages and they had a large part of their income was not paid because of non-flying hours. Now, I think what a lot of people don't realize in aviation, in transportation in general, you have typically non-transporting hours and then transporting hours. So when I drove buses, we had, uh, two categories of driving. We had basically driving time, and then we had on-work non-driving time. So driving time was when that bus was moving. Non-work, or to say working non-driving time was whenever we were responsible for that bus, but we weren't moving. And typically how we worked was whenever the bus wasn't moving, but we were responsible for the bus, these were rest stops, these were loading and unloading, we were paid a percentage of our pay, where when the bus was moving, we were paid 100% of our hourly wage. Well, in aviation, we typically get paid by the flight hour. Most companies just pay by the flight hour. There are some cases in which you will be paid for non-flight hours, but for most of us in aviation, we get what's called min pay. So part of your contract is you get a minimum amount of pay every month, no, from basically flying from 0 hours up to a certain number of hours. So, a lot of companies, it was around 70 hours. Some companies go even higher, but I think around 70 hours is going to be the average. That means whether you fly or not, whether you're loading the airplane, whether you're unloading the airplane, you're guaranteed to get 70 hours worth of pay at your full flight hour pay. And then once if you for some reason flew past those 70 hours, then you would get your hourly rate on top of that. But most people don't do that, especially at large airlines. Many of us fly below our hours and often try to pick up extra hours if you want that extra pay. And really what offsets that for pilots is a very high wage. Right? It's a very high hourly wage, and that kind of offsets it. But at my first flying gig, we weren't paid very high hourly wages. We were paid very little. It sounded high, but considering the hours that we flew, it wasn't. At my first gig, I was flying a PC-12, and I was right seat working as a first officer. And we were being paid $30 an hour, which was considered really good for a first gig, FO gig. But when all said and done, we never went over our mins. We worked our butt off, and I was pulling in on average like $1,400 a month. Why? Because I was only getting paid for flight hours. I was not getting paid for commute. I was not being paid for layovers, for, loading and unloading, none of that stuff. And so it was really rough. I basically survived by just working more hours to try and fulfill the money I needed to pay my bills. What you'll find is because a lot of these companies don't pay for non-flying hours, it can be rough. It's basically what these flight attendants were going through, and a lot of pilots go through this, unfortunately. The only thing that's harder for flight attendants is they just don't have the pay scale of pilots. Pilots, we go to another gig, it's typically a significant bump. For my first gig, we were making, like 24, 30 grand per year. My second gig, that jumped up to like 60 grand. My third gig, it jumped up to about 80 grand. Then once I got to a major airlines, it dropped back down to around 65,000 per year. But then the year two jumped over 100 and change per year. So it just scales up. But to this day, there's still a lot of stuff I don't get paid for. To give you an example, at my first gig, flying the PC-12, I had to, I was based in Denver, but I live in Los Angeles. So it was up to me to commute. So we had flight benefits, which allowed me to hop on a flight for free and get to where I needed to start my work. So I got up at like 5 a.m. in the morning, hopped on a flight from Los Angeles to Denver. My flights were, it's just like a 2-hour flight. My flights were supposed to start at around, like 8 a.m. and go until about 8 p.m. that night. So it was a 12-hour day, but out of that 12-hour days, I was scheduled to only fly like around 6 or 7 hours. So even though it was a 12-hour day, I would have only been paid for about 6 hours of work. Now, on this particular day, we had maintenance problems, which pretty much grounded the fleet for the entire day, or grounded the plane that we were supposed to use for the entire day. So I sat at the airport waiting for maintenance to fix the planes for hours until they actually just sent us to a hotel for the rest of the day. Now, despite being up since 5 a.m. and not even getting back to the hotel until like around 4 or 5 in the afternoon, after already putting in 12 hours of that day, that entire day, I was compensated for a min pay, which was like around $80. Yeah. So I put in a 12-hour day and I was paid about $80 for that day. So it can be rough, it can be real rough. I had one week where I went out and we just had so many maintenance problems, scheduling issues, pilots were calling out sick, where I was out, and luckily the company was cool enough that I called them and I told them, I said, hey, I have a lot of hours scheduled, and because of all this downtime, I was losing like $500 from just, not flying for a week of just back and forth. And they were cool enough to understand that, we weren't making much money, that they were going to compensate me because it wasn't my fault that we had so much time where we were not flying and thus not getting paid, but yet we were stuck in Denver not being paid. So it can be pretty rough, Once you get to a major airline, it's the only thing, it's still the same rules, but your min pay is just so much higher that it somewhat compensates for it. To this day, I still have flights where, for example, I did a flight the other day from Cincinnati to Richmond to Wilmington, Ohio. Flight time of all of about, I don't know, maybe like 3 hours. But because we had to wait almost 4 hours for them to load, then an hour of pre-tripping, and then post-flight and all that stuff, getting to and from the hotel, commuting, it was like a 9-hour day. But again, I was only compensated for about 3 hours of time that the flight was actually flying. But of course, I was compensated at about $120 an hour, so it kind of evens itself out. Where when I was working at the small airline, my first gig, I had days where I spent all day at work not flying, or getting in an hour or something like that, to turn around and realize I was getting maybe like less than $10 an hour for the amount of time I was actually at work. And what makes it even harder is, unlike your minimum wage job or your job where you're at home, you get to go home. If you're making $10 an hour, let's say you're working at, I don't know, McDonald's or something, at the end of the day, you get to go home, you get to be with your loved ones. And in aviation, we don't get that. You get to go to a hotel, you get to wait for your next trip. Sometimes you get miserable nights where, you get minimum rest, so you just get enough time to get the legal amount of rest and then go back to work all day. And it can be very tiring, very stressful. This is why, though when you're working for a lot of these companies, they'll give you a large stretch of days off, where we'll work for like 12 days straight, and then we'll get like, 12 days off. And I tell people all the time, when I get home for the first like 2 or 3 days, I just sleep. I will get home and just be so exhausted. The the chronic fatigue builds up so high where I will just sleep for just like, 12, 13 hours, get something to eat, and then go back to sleep for like another 8 hours or so. And it takes a couple days to get back into the rhythm of having a normal sleep schedule and be feeling rested. So I just wanted you guys to understand that. This is basically how the system works. Is it a fair system? Probably not, especially when your wages are so low that it really isn't a fair system. I think if you're making such small per hour wages, that you really should be compensated for the time that you're at the job, not just, flying the airplane. And once you get to, if you're a pilot and you're getting to the higher wages, then it doesn't become as much of an issue because you're already making so much money that you don't really care about it. It would be nice to have that money, but you're already at such a high wage. You learn how to manipulate the system to work less and make more and all that stuff. And there's a bunch of extras that you can do to try and offset that income and that time that you're spending without being paid as well. So, trust me, every pilot, every flight attendant, every ground crew is with, the Canadian crew and understands exactly what they're going through. And it's still a struggle at a lot of airlines. So, tell me what you guys think. It's been a while since I posted a video. I've just been, killing it, trying to get these hours to make captain. I've been on vacation for a little bit. I spent some time in Southeast Asia, which was pretty fun. And I'll try to put up some more videos. If you guys have any questions, I got one other video I'll probably make here soon and responding to some comments. And if you guys have any questions, anything you want to see, just feel free to leave it down in the comments. And thanks for watching my videos.